As the crisis in Ukraine continues, countries in Russia's immediate proximity are confronted with difficult choices, that is, to join NATO or not. This debate is especially notable in Sweden and Finland, where public support for the alliance's membership has risen. A survey in Finland showed that support for NATO membership increased from 20% in 2013 to 22% in 2014. A similar survey was held in Sweden, which showed an increase from 30% to 36% in 2013 and 2014, respectively. Now, it's important to note that these numbers vary slightly from poll to poll, but one thing is certain. The overwhelming majority in both countries opposed joining NATO. And it is for this reason that both countries have held no referendums regarding this subject, simply because the local political parties fully know they would lose such a referendum. Those who do support joining NATO argue that the alliance would protect Finland or Sweden from Russia. But skeptics argue that the very act of joining NATO could provoke Russia against the two countries. So despite lacking the general support, this does bring forth an interesting question. Just how feasible is the proposal to join NATO for Finland and Sweden? Welcome to a Caspian Report by me, Shirvan. For questions, contact or information, please visit the Facebook page in the description section. Finland shares a long border with Russia, approximately 1,340 kilometers, and throughout its history, Finland has seen its share of Russian aggression. In Russian history, Finland is often portrayed as the country that got away. You see, in 1809, the Finnish War, which was fought between the Kingdom of Sweden and the Russian Empire, came to an end. Russia was victorious and annexed the eastern portion of Sweden as the Grand Duchy of Finland. But during the turmoil that followed the Russian Revolution in 1917, Finland declared and secured its independence. In 1939, in what is now known as the Winter War, Finland was the only country in Eastern Europe to successfully fight off the invading Red Army, eventually reaching a stalemate with the Soviet Union in 1940. The final Finnish-Russian military confrontation was in 1941 when Finland joined Nazi Germany in an attack on the Soviet Union. Germany, and obviously Finland, was defeated and ceded nearly 10% of its territory, including its second largest city, Viipuri, now known as Viborg. Following this defeat, Finland signed several treaties with the Soviet Union in 1948, including the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance. This agreement became known as Finlandization, and it was basically Moscow accepting Finland's independence as long as Helsinki abstained from a stronger military integration with the West. So Finland maintained its neutrality throughout the Cold War up until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Once the USSR broke down, Finnish foreign policy became more flexible, and the country joined the European Union in 1995, but refrained from joining NATO. Meanwhile, Sweden has no land border with Russia, but the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, with its large military base, is about 300 kilometers away from the Swedish island of Gotland, which plays a critical role in the national security of Sweden. Historically speaking, Sweden was an arch-enemy of Russia. For centuries, the Russians and the Swedish fought long and bloody wars over the control of the Baltic region. Eventually, the Finnish War of 1809 dealt a devastating blow to Sweden, and ever since then, Sweden has pursued a policy of military non-alignment, which kept the country out of World War I, and to a certain extent, it kept the country out of World War II. But most importantly, the non-alignment policy kept Sweden out of the Cold War, which really determined the identity of their foreign policy. But this policy was neglected during the 1990s with Sweden's support to the independence of the three Baltic states. Ironically, Sweden supported and promoted the inclusion of the Baltic countries into NATO, but Stockholm itself never joined the alliance. Later on, like Finland, Sweden joined the European Union in 1995. So from a historical point of view, Finland and Sweden share very similar national interests. That's also why both countries together kept a neutral position during the Cold War, and both countries together joined the European Union in the same year. This interdependency was further highlighted in January 2014 when the governments of both countries agreed that in regard to their future with NATO, they would proceed hand in hand. Which means this is a package deal. Either both countries join NATO or both countries stay out of NATO. So that much is certain. What is also certain is that there is no public support in Finland or in Sweden for the membership of NATO. Every survey attests to this fact. The majority of the Finnish and Swedish people fiercely believe in their neutral policy. But the reality is that both countries are already tightly integrated in the economic institution of the West. Both countries are part of the EU, and both countries are part of NATO's Partnership for Peace program and participate in many joint activities, including joint exercises, cooperation on scientific research, environmental issues, disaster management, etc. Both countries also have contributed troops and resources to NATO-led missions in the Balkans and in Afghanistan. So even though the public might believe in their neutrality, the reality is that Sweden and Finland lost their neutral policies when they diverged from that path in the aftermath of the breakdown of the USSR. The only thing that is neutral in the Swedish and Finnish policy is their military non-alignment, and that seems to be good enough for Russia. But with the continuing escalation of the crisis in Ukraine, some hardline Nordic politicians are debating the possibility of joining NATO. So that brings up an important question. What does the NATO expansion into Sweden and Finland add to the alliance? Well, for one, both countries have top-notch military technologies and industries. In fact, Stockholm and Helsinki are more NATO compatible than most existing NATO members. Second, the NATO expansion to Sweden and Finland would send a symbolic message to Russia that military aggression in Europe will not go by without major geopolitical consequences. Third, from a strategic point of view, the inclusion of Sweden and Finland plays two strategic roles. One, it would allow NATO to push the alliance's frontier even closer to Russia, and this would leave the Russian forces spread even thinner on the European plain. In a previous Caspian report, we talked about the geopolitical and strategic interests of Russia in the European plain. But equally important, and this is the fourth point, Sweden's and Finland's addition to NATO would turn the Baltic Sea into a NATO-dominated sea with important geopolitical purposes. Most of Russia's vital trade and energy exports go through this region. So just imagine what it would mean for Russia if this sea became NATO-dominated. It would leave the Russians vulnerable to NATO pressure, ironically in the same way that the Russians pressure their own neighbors. Also, a NATO-dominated Baltic Sea would drastically strengthen NATO's position in the Baltic countries, as it would improve the logistical capabilities. So obviously this is not a scenario Russia is looking forward to. This was further highlighted back in 2013 by the Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, when he stated that any expansion of NATO to Sweden and Finland would upset the balance of power in Europe and force a Russian response. This response would most likely entail an economic war in the form of restrictions on imports. In this context, Sweden would face fewer repercussions than Finland because it doesn't share a land border with Russia, and Russia isn't a top trading partner of Sweden. But for Finland, Russia is the largest import partner and the second largest export destination. In 2013, Finland exported goods worth about $7.4 billion to Russia and imported goods from Russia worth about $11.9 billion. So Moscow has significant influence over the Finnish economy. And if you think this is a far-fetched scenario, think of what's at stake for Russia. And think of August 2013 when Russia imposed import restrictions on Ukraine to put pressure on Kiev to decline the EU agreement. So an economic war is the most likely immediate outcome of Finland and Sweden joining NATO. The long-term outcome would be the escalation of a new Cold War with a whole new frontier. All of this comes down to one thing: joining NATO would not protect Finland or Sweden from Russia, but instead it would provoke Russia and thus harm the national interests of the two countries. The military non-alignment of Stockholm and Helsinki proved to be successful during the Cold War. Even at the height of Soviet strength, did the Soviets honor the agreement of Finlandization. So based on historic experience and the national interests of the Nordic countries, neither Finland nor Sweden will be joining NATO anytime soon. But perhaps the biggest obstacle to their membership is the low public support in the countries. The public support or public opinion is very dynamic. It's influenced by events that are confined to certain factors such as distance, duration, and culture. For example, let's say Russia attacked and annexed northern Kazakhstan instead of Crimea. That would have had a much smaller response from Europe. So the closer an event unfolds and the deeper the cultural ties and the longer the event persists, the bigger the influence on the public opinion. With this in mind, the longer the crisis in Ukraine persists, the more public support will shift towards NATO membership in Finland and Sweden. And again, the more Russia becomes assertive to the Baltic countries, the more public support for NATO will grow in Helsinki and Stockholm. This was a Caspian report by me, Shirvan. If you found this video helpful, please consider sharing it on your favorite social media pages. So thank you for watching, and Sarol.